am going to ask that if you are not speaking, that you mute yourself. Please. I am Natasha Santos. I am the program coordinator here at Brooklyn for Peace, and I'm so happy that you guys could join us. Just see a raise of hands, quick poll. How many people here tonight are educators or in the education system? Okay, I'm seeing some raised hands. I like that. I love it. So you guys have vested interest in this conversation, and I'm so glad that you took the time out of your day to be here with us and to have this really important conversation. So a bit of housekeeping. This forum is being recorded, and it is also going to be live streamed on Facebook. If you're okay with that, great. If not, please turn off your camera. We understand, and you're still invited to participate. As I've said before, I'm Natasha. I am the program coordinator here. I'm moderating this discussion along with Gloria Brandman. Gloria, can you please say hello? Unmute yourself, Gloria. There you go.
Oh, hi again. Welcome. Glad to be here. Glad everybody is here.
Gloria, would you like to introduce yourself really quickly?
Okay, I'm Gloria Brandman. I am a retired New York City public school teacher, 34 years as a special educator. I've been an education activist for almost that many years, a union activist as well, anti-war stuff. I'm currently an organizer with Move the Money, New York City, and I'm also working with UFT, the Retiree Advocates group.
Great. Yeah, that was great, Gloria. Thank you so much. Gloria has been working with BFP for a while. She's been in our orbit, and she's been so great. We're so lucky to have her work with us. She's amazing. Like I said, the Zoom is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. And for the new people that joined, if you're okay with that, great. If you're not okay with that, feel free to turn off your video, and we still welcome you to participate. Really quickly, as we're having this discussion, I know, as always, we invite people to be in this discussion. And if you have something to say or would like to add, please do. You can use the raise hand function. Or you can raise your actual hand. Noam Bonnie and Sam Koprak are co-moderating with me tonight, and they are going to be helping keep track of everybody that wants to participate. I'm sorry, I'm feeling nervous for some reason. That happens to me sometimes, even virtually. I would like to note or to recognize and acknowledge that we are on, all of us, Lenape land. This was originally land settled and taken care of by Native Americans, the Lenape tribe. And we are part of that history, like that's part of our history. I would like to take a moment of silence to recognize and think about all the people we've lost this year to the pandemic, all the people we've lost this year to police violence, and all the people we've lost this year for lack of universal health coverage. And some of the names that we've lost to police violence are Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, sorry, nervous again. And I'd like to take a moment of silence to recognize them. So if you will. All right, thank you guys so much for that. I think it's really important to recognize the people that we've lost this year to police violence and to, you know, just the unfortunateness that this year is. My computer's doing something weird right now. I want to recognize that, but I'm still here. So this is going to be a bit different than our other virtual forums. We have 5 panelists. They're all amazing, and we're so happy that they all decided to join us today. Kevin Bryant, Leonie Hamison, Jonathan Howabee, Caleres Salas Ramirez, and Tracy Willesee. They are all expertise in their field. They are all knowledgeable on New York City's public education system, particularly the DOE, and they are all really great speakers. Our hope for today, our goal is to have an engaging discussion, / conversation on COVID's impact on education, especially in communities of color, and how that's exacerbated the inequities that these communities and these students already experience. Like I said, we're live streaming this on our Facebook account, and you can find that at Brooklyn for Peace by searching Brooklyn for Peace in the Facebook search bar. You can also look at our Instagram account, Brooklyn, the letter 4 and Peace, and the same with our Twitter account, Brooklyn, the letter 4 and Peace. We ask that we create a brave space and give people, everyone, equal opportunity to share and equal opportunity to be heard. So far, does anyone have any questions about tonight? All right, I love to hear it. So I'd like to start by introducing our first panelist, who I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, and I'm so happy to work with him in this capacity again. His name is Kevin Bryant, and for 15 years, he has been a part of the New York City Department of Education. He has been an integral part, information as a student, educator, and leader. Kevin entered education through the New York City Teaching Fellows, where he taught mathematics in Canarsie, Brooklyn. Throughout his time in the DOE, he served in many leadership capacities, most notably a turnaround and master principal, which is where I met him at Francis Perkins Academy and then Automotive High School. Kevin has used his role as an urban school leader to ensure that zip code or ethnic background is not an indicator for academic success, specifically among marginalized groups. Kevin Bryant is currently on a break from school leadership as a doctoral candidate in the Doctor of Education Leadership program at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, where Kevin continues to focus on the intersection of diversity in leadership. Kevin, Mr. Bryant, thank you so much for joining us today. Please say hello.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for having me on the panel. And hopefully you get some gems from the panelists and myself as we talk about the things that are happening with our students in our education system.
Thank you, Mr. Bryant. Gloria, you can introduce the next person.
Okay, I have the honor of introducing Leonie Hamison, who is the founder and executive director of Class Size Matters, which she started in 2000. It advocates for smaller classes in New York City's public schools and the nation as a whole. She was a public school parent for 15 years, and New York Times has called her the city's leading proponent of smaller classes. Class Size Matters provides information on the benefits of small classes, and it also helps parents learn how to become more involved in decision-making at school, district, state, and national levels. In 2013, she led a fight against the Gates Foundation, $100 million data collection project, which spun off to become In Bloom Inc., which many of us have heard of, and she helped to stop it. And as a result of the increased parent awareness about the need to strengthen student privacy, nearly 100 new state student privacy laws were passed. And she co-founded an organization, Parent Coalition for Student Privacy, which I will add right now, it's needed more than ever. And she'll probably talk about that. In January 2015, Leonie helped spearhead a successful lawsuit in court to keep school leadership teams meeting open to the public. And in 2018, she helped organize the parents of PS 25, a high-needs school in Brooklyn, which had small class sizes. And the DOE wanted to close it and give more space to a charter school. But they won, the battle was won thanks to Leonie, and the DOE withdrew the proposal to close the school. So she's received numerous awards. I don't have time to go through them all. And she also, I'm sorry, I just lost my crib sheet, but I'll just end by saying she's a blogger. You can see her every Wednesday right now on WBAI and Talk Out of School. It's a great show, and I've had the privilege of standing with Leonie at in front of the town hall, at court hearings, and I present to you Leonie.
Thank you, Gloria. That was a wonderful introduction, one of the best I've ever had. You reminded me of good things, which I needed right now. And thank you for your support at so many of our rallies and events. I'm really happy to be here tonight. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you again. You are muted, Gloria. Next up, Gloria is going to introduce Jonathan.
Okay, just give me one quick second while I find what I am looking for. And okay, Jonathan Howabee is a career teacher. He is a high school math teacher in his 23rd year, the last 18 of them at the High School of American Studies at Lehman College. He has been a U of T chapter leader for almost 2 decades and served in opposition on the U of T executive board for over 10 years. What that means is he did not run as a candidate on the ruling Unity Party of the U of T. And this is not an easy feat to achieve, let me tell you. Jonathan's blog can be read at jd2718.org. And through the pandemic, he has been actively advocating for keeping schools remote until we can be safe, and for issues of justice, fairness, and equity. Jonathan is also a math wizard, and he makes this subject magical for his students. In his limited time, Jonathan is a hiker in the great outdoors, and I've seen his wonderful pictures. So I worked on U of T election campaigns with Jonathan, and during the last 6 months, I've been able to learn about the realities of what's going on inside the schools from religiously reading Jonathan's blogs. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. Please say hello.
Thank you for that really generous and wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It feels like I'm speaking with really fairly illustrious panel. I'm not sure that I truly belong here, but I'll try to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, like, okay. Of course you belong here. You're great and you're brilliant, and we're so lucky to have you. Next, we're going to introduce, or Gloria's going to introduce
Caleras, right. Now, Caleras Salas Ramirez is a distinguished medical lecturer at the CUNY School of Medicine in New York City. She has received federal funding and has published her work in over a dozen peer-reviewed journals. Her research focus is understanding sex-specific interventions for cognitive decline resulting from drug exposure during different stages of development. Heavy. Nevertheless, Dr. Salas's passion is mentoring and elevating students from underrepresented groups. Originally from Puerto Rico, she has lived in New York City for 11 years, where she is raising her 2 gorgeous sons. She fights for educational equity for students from pre-K to higher ed, with the hopes of living in an anti-racist community. Dr. Salas is president of CEC 4, the Council for Education. Oh, no, that's not what it stands for. I'll remember in a minute. And part of the steering and advisory committee of Press New York City Opt-out, and BLM at Schools, New York City. Community Educational Council 4. Okay, Caleres has also been a speaker at conferences and panel discussions. She was featured in an education town hall discussing the crisis in Puerto Rico regarding closing public schools and privatizing public ed. So briefly, I met Caleres in 2016 when her son was a student at Central Park East 1, a small, progressive, child-centered elementary school. She helped initiate a campaign to protect the school from a new principal that was placed there. A majority of the parents were unhappy with this administrator. She was very unfair to the students and teachers and parents, and her attempts to change the entire culture of the school were horrifying to the staff. So I supported the teachers at court hearings, at PEP meetings, and thankfully the parents succeeded in getting this principal removed. It also got a Skinny Award from Class Size Matters. Caleres, please say hello.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that, Gloria. Yeah, we fought really hard, and Leonie was part of that, and Jonathan was part of that, and we got a lot of support from lots of educators, and we're fortunately in a much better place, not just as a school, but also as a district in East Harlem. Things are moving forward. I'm part of the steering committee of Press NYC, which was created out of the need of informing parents about safety in schools. So PRESS stands for Parents for Responsive, Equitable, Safe Schools. And we've written a lot about what the deal breakers are around this plan that the mayor has presented to us, and what are the dangers in terms of COVID in our schools. And we've really tried to focus on the inequities that have been so highlighted by this pandemic. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Caleres. Thank you so much for being here and sharing, your experience and your knowledge with us. Last, but certainly not least, is someone who, I love. I've known her since I was 8 years old. She's one of my teachers in elementary school, and she has stayed with me throughout. Well, I'm 32 now, so that's a really long time. She has been an educator. She has been a mentor. She has been a friend. She has been a vice principal. She has been so many things to so many people. Tracy Ann Willisey is a wife, a mother, and a teacher. This is her 23rd year teaching for the Department of Education in District 23, Brooklyn, New York. She has taught grades 3 through 6 in all subjects. She is passionate about teaching students about nature, the benefits of preserving the environment, and the impact they have on their community. And she's definitely had an impact on me. It's my honor to introduce Miss Tracy Ann Willisey. Miss Willisey.
You're gonna make me cry, Natasha. Thank you guys so much for inviting me. You're gonna make me cry. I think the most important thing about being a teacher is fostering relationships that last even after they leave your classroom.
Yeah.
And I think, that's what we bring to the table. And right now, with COVID-19, I must say I'm having the best teaching year ever, because I only have 10 kids in my class, and I get to reach out and touch everyone and really figure out, okay, this is what you're not getting. Okay, we're going to work on it, because it's such a small classroom. And when I see the remote kids, we get to interact with the remote kids and the kids who are in school, and just, building that social stuff that they don't really get right now. So thank you so much, Natasha. I love you too.
Aww. I'm her favorite student ever. I'm just going to put that out there. So again, a bit about tonight. So we have 4 framing questions to start the discussion and get our panelists speaking. We ask again for everyone in the audience that if you are not speaking, that you mute yourself, because feedback, we are virtual, things get crazy. If you do have a question for our audience, or you would like to add something, please raise your hand. You can use the chat feature to raise your hand, or you can raise your actual hand. Noam, Bonnie, and Sam Koprak, they are our tech moderators, and they will let us know that someone has a question. So before we begin again, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to do gallery view so I can see more people. Look at all these beautiful faces. No, we're good to go? Okay. So the question, as we all know, COVID-19 has really changed everything about our lives. It's changed the way we interact with each other. It's changed the way we vote. It's changed the way we learn, and it's disrupted in every way, what it means to be a student and what it means to be a teacher. What happens when a public school system that is already taking on so much is dealing with a global pandemic? We all know that New York City school system is far from perfect. We know that the men and women and people that work really hard to make it what it is are sometimes fighting an uphill battle, and that inequality isn't a bug in the New York City school system, it's kind of a feature. So what happens when that inequity that's always been there meets up with COVID? How are the parents, the educators, the students, how are they dealing with this? This panel is going to discuss some of those questions, and they're also going to answer some of yours. So without further ado, my first question to the panelists. What inequities and problems has COVID created for low-income communities of color? And also, to what extent has COVID merely brought pre-existing inequalities to light? Big question. Jonathan, you're muted.
Looking for the unmute before I tried to talk. I probably have the least to say right now, but most specific, maybe I'll jump in first. I teach at a school that's pretty privileged overall, but not completely. We have a range of students, but we do have more affluent students, more affluent white students than most schools in the city. I see through remote teaching real differences in environment, differences between students who have work responsibilities or childcare responsibilities and students who don't. That's a real inequity. I see space issues, students who share space with several siblings, or students who have their own space, or students who only have access to computer in a common area. Those are issues not of education, but of housing, of work, of income, but housing inequality, work inequality, income inequality. And they get brought to relief every single day. And I know that's only a small part of what's going on, but that's what I'm observing firsthand.
So could I speak now? Is this a good time?
Of course, go ahead, yes.
So the main issues I focus on as an education advocate are directly affected and implicated in the widening inequities caused by COVID. As we know from research and experience, smaller classes are a key driver of equity. All kids benefit from smaller classes, but those who benefit the most are disadvantaged kids, kids in poverty, kids of color, English language learners, and special needs students who see twice the benefits from smaller classes in terms of enhanced learning and enhanced engagement than average white middle class kids. And yet New York City has class sizes 15 to 30% larger on average than in the rest of the state. More than 300,000 kids were in classes of 30 or more last year, and more than 500,000 were in overcrowded schools, according to the DOE's own data. So when schools reopened, in part for hybrid learning, in order to achieve social distancing, many were only able to offer students in-person learning once or twice a week. Private schools and those in the suburbs where overcrowded conditions are less extreme were able to open up to more in-person learning, and many have 5 days a week of in-person learning, especially in the elementary grades. In addition, because of staffing shortages and the way the DOE school reopening plan was devised, schools were allowed to double the usual union contractual class size for hybrid online learning to 50 students in kindergarten and 64 to 68 kids per class in other grades, which of course is totally ridiculous class size and unable to keep kids engaged in learning and provide sufficient feedback to them. Some parents have even reported inclusion classes with special needs students as large as 80 students this year. We also know that online learning doesn't work well for most students, but those it does absolutely worse for are the same groups that benefit from smaller classes the most. Disadvantaged kids, kids of color, English language learners, kids with special needs. The research is pretty strong on this, and these findings hold true even when these students have equal access to devices and the internet. And I know that Caleres and others will talk later about how many of our kids in New York City do not have that equal access to the internet, unfortunately. But I just wanted to make the point that there's a real disadvantage even when they do. Online instruction diminishes learning and engagement for these students in every way that can be measured, whether through test scores, student surveys, attendance, graduation rates, and more. In-person learning is also key to the social emotional development of children and teenage kids in terms of helping them learn how to collaborate, debate, and learn tolerance for others. From student surveys, we know that remote learning has contributed to increased levels of anxiety and depression among many students, and we are likely to see higher dropout rates, higher failure rates, fewer kids headed towards college as a result. So the imposition of online learning, whether part-time or full-time, is going to widen these gaps even more and exacerbate the inequities that already exist within and among New York City schools and between New York City and the rest of the state, where in-person learning is more frequent and more likely to continue even into the fall and winter. The other issue that I'm deeply involved in and that Gloria mentioned is student privacy. Parents here in New York City and throughout the state pushed hard for a state student privacy law to be passed in 2014, which then it took the state education department nearly 6 years to issue regulations so it could be enforced. The regulations were finalized in January 2020. Shortly thereafter, the COVID crisis hit, schools were closed, and the DOE hurriedly adopted more than 100 online programs developed and operated by private companies and told schools that they had to have a, quote, shared, inclusive, and digital curriculum in all core subject areas in order to implement remote learning. I'm not clear whether that all schools have done that. I'd love to hear from teachers and principals on this meeting to find out. But one of the things we're concerned about is that we don't know whether these programs are compliant with state law and whether they're protecting student data. The state law says that data can't be sold or used for commercial purposes, must be protected with rigorous security protocols, and districts must be transparent about how the data is being used. They must do this by ensuring there's a contractual parent bill of rights with every agreement, which must be posted online for parents to see. And yet the DOE has not yet posted a single contract with any of these ed tech vendors. And many of the products have gotten low grades for privacy because their publicly available privacy policies either commercialize the data or lack strong security protections. So along with the implementation of remote learning, which is an inherently inadequate mode of learning for most kids that will likely widen inequities, at the same time, there's a much increased risk that New York City student data may be sold, commercialized, breached, or otherwise misused in ways that could be deeply harmful for their future.
Thank you, Leonie, so much. I can see, like, well, you're well informed, but you researched that. Like, yeah, you know what you're talking about. That was a lot. Does Caleres, Tracy, Kevin, or Jonathan want to chime in here?
Well, I just want to add to that. This is Tracy Willisey. So I think one of the major inequities that I've seen are the students with special needs. So out of my 61 students, I have 20 students that are special needs. And those are the students that are not logging on. And when they do log on, they complain about it's a lot of stimulation working remotely with the visuals and the mute yourself and the noise in the background. And you can't really teach their modality when it's just remote learning. And I think it's impacting them, even if they have speech or whatever other services that you're getting in addition to having a special education teacher in the classroom, it's not the same. And I think we're going to see that impact later on in terms of students with IEPs. I have 61 students and 41 are remote, 20 are in school. 3 of my students currently do not have devices. The rest of them have devices from the DOE or their own with Wi-Fi or data. And I'm gonna say of the 59, maybe 35 log on a daily basis, whether they're in school or remotely. And it's really hard because of a lot of family issues, or we just don't know what the issue is because we can't see them. And so some of those students already had attendance issues. And I think that's going to be another major factor. We're not seeing them, they're not coming to school, very little contact in terms of what's going on at home. And, you know, eventually they are going to be in high school, and what's going to happen when they're in high school, because COVID will be over eventually soon one day. And the concern is, how are we going to help those students academically and emotionally? So that's kind of like what I've seen in the classroom.
And for my well, what before this school year started, what could the DOE have done? Like,
the DOE could have engaged the community in figuring out a plan. I mean, what they did was not talk to anybody and have the mayor decide what he wanted to do. And he wanted to open up businesses. And he's basically put our kids up as experiments in making this happen. I do want to say, for example, in communities like mine, which is East Harlem District 4, which is predominantly composed of immigrant families, families of color, families that live below the line of poverty, 60% of my community is remote. My community was also the hardest hit in all of Manhattan by COVID. So a lot of our families do not want to send their children into school because they don't believe that it's safe. So I don't think it's fair to say and really talk right now about how remote really sucks, because it kind of does for a lot of kids. But the conversation has to be, how is it that we're going to support these families? A major inequity that we see is the lack of devices. So my district, ideally, if our students were to be served in an equitable way, would require about another 4,000 devices in order to support all of the students in the district.
how many devices do they have?
I'm sorry?
How many students are without devices, I mean?
So we have 1,500 devices that have been requested, but then we've also surveyed our principals and asked our principals how many devices they would ideally need in their schools. We have 23 schools. And so the survey has shown that they need about 3,600 devices in order for there to be an ideal scenario that everybody has a device. And so we're talking about an issue in terms of tech equity. We're also talking about rethinking curriculum, rethinking how relationships are going to be done. The same way that there have been lots of kids of color that may not engage because they're doing things remotely, the same way that some kids with IEPs don't engage. There are a lot of kids with IEPs that do really well with remote interventions and teletherapy. There are a lot of Black and brown kids that are like, thank God I don't have to go to school because I don't have to deal with somebody bullying me. I don't have to listen to microaggressions. There's no time to single me out. I'm not being policed. Suspensions have gone down. So all of these additional equities that also existed, we've seen that they don't really need to exist within the system. Chancellor Betty Rosa has also eliminated the regents for January. A lot of us want to push for the elimination of standardized tests so we can stop standardizing children. And those are the kinds of things that continue to create an access gap for our children moving forward. So I think we need to start having the conversation of what is it that we need to do when we are not dealing with a pandemic where people are dealing with survivorship right now. What are we going to do when they come back to school? And what are we going to do in order to make remote learning better and connect with our students in a better way?
Thank you. Mr. Bryant, as a former principal, how would you have dealt with this, or could you have dealt with this as a principal?
Yeah, luckily I'm not in the seat right now, but it's very interesting to watch what's happening from afar. I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that you're constantly changing. Like, information is coming very rapidly. A decision that you may have made a week ago may not be applicable the current week. And so I think one of the biggest things, like Gloria said, is really listening to what your community needs. Two, in supporting your teachers and making the transition between what was in person into remote. And three, really thinking about like what are supports necessary for the kids. I think there are elements that are remote learning that are positive and beneficial to some students, and there are some that are not. That's my son's birthday today, so he's in the background chilling out.
Happy birthday.
And so, you know, as a principal, I think the biggest thing for me is like, how do we ensure, or how would I be able to get additional funding to ensure that the tech gap was closed? Because if you remember, we didn't have a lot of technology in our school building. That would be the biggest piece. And then two, how do we ensure that our kids are at least connected to an adult within the building? I think this is an opportunity to be a little innovative in terms of connecting with students I think 60 kids is a lot, but but if you bring in a non-instructional staff, such as cafeteria individuals, such as school safety, you can actually build a little bit more of a coalition, a community of individuals who can actually connect with students in a more familial type of environment.
So thank you, Mr. Bryant. I hope it's okay. I think I mentioned this yesterday. I mean, when we had the run through, Mr. Bryant's wife, his partner, is also a principal. It's like birds of a feather. How is she doing with it?
Well, she's no longer principal either. So she's out of, so she actually is working with Ed Trust and really looking at policies to push things in New York State to ensure equitable outcomes for all students. And so I get to see her world from the policy lens, and then I'm doing some work that's happening in a nonprofit lens for our college board. And so like we have competing views, but actually pushing towards similar outcomes.
That's an education power couple right there. Does anyone, I see you, Tessa. Does anyone have a question or something they would like to add to this conversation? Any of our, anyone from our audience? All right, I see that, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So I think I would like to just say a few words, and I think I'm going to ask our next question because it just follows right into it. I also am just so fortunate to not be teaching right now because I see how the teachers are struggling. The parents and the students are too, but I know the teachers are really working so very hard to try to make those relationships, which are very hard to do on the internet. I worked with small groups. I did multisensory learning for children that had learning disabilities. I don't know how I would do that on the internet remotely. I don't think it would work very well. So I think the positive things that are going on are truly amazing. I also thought schools shouldn't open, and so that would have been time to really plan out better ways for it to work. And now I'm reading these numbers that the numbers are going up in the city, but in the schools, the numbers are still very small. I think that's misleading. I don't know what it really means because we know not everyone is getting tested. So it feels comforting. Okay, let's keep the schools open because so few children are getting sick, but there are so few children in the schools. So it is a dilemma, and we need more parent and teacher input. So we have another question that might help lead us to try to figure out some solutions. What would you say are the 2 or 3 most important changes you would make in schools to create more equity? For example, desegregation, changing curriculum, of course, smaller classes. And we've already talked about the equal access to technology. That's a hard one because even if they have the devices, they need the internet. It's a two-way thing. And with the disparity in the economic situation of our families, it's just a hard one. But those are some questions that perhaps we can talk about, or any other ideas you might have.
Well, obviously, as a class size advocate, I believe that one of the most important things we could do to achieve real equity in New York City schools would be to reduce class size, which would take obviously a lot of money, more staffing, more teachers, and more space, because we have, as I said, some of the most overcrowded schools in the entire state and in the entire country. According to DOE's own data, over 500,000 students are in overcrowded schools. So we would be able to reduce class size tomorrow in some parts of the city, and would have to build a lot more schools in many parts of the city. And so it would take a long-term effort. However, as the mayor showed when he put a lot of money and priority into pre-K, he managed to find space and build space for a lot of pre-K students very, very quickly. So it's not impossible to do if you have the willingness and the budget to do it. Now, of course, the city is facing a huge budget crunch, as is the state. So, and the federal government so far has not been particularly generous. So we would need to raise revenue. And I think there are a lot of revenue proposals out there at the state level that could raise billions of dollars. And I'm happy to talk about that later if people are interested.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Abigail, you had something to say? You had a question, actually.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, I guess I'll just read the question I had in the chat. Thank you to this incredible panel. Yeah, just one question was, I've heard that the Trump administration's federal grants were really forcing cities to consider reopening, and I'm wondering how much the city was kind of like forced to do this by the federal government's policies, and how much people feel like de Blasio's administration is to blame. And then the second question just being that, like, yeah, like my aunt works at PS2 in Chinatown, and I hear from her, as well as from people on this panel, sort of like how, like, you know, maybe special education students and certain other groups might have really needed that in-person learning the most, but maybe everyone else should not have been given this choice. Maybe everyone else should just have been encouraged to study remotely. So I'm curious if that's like the consensus, if there is a consensus. Yeah, I don't know what my aunt's opinion is. I don't want to speak for her, but yeah, so thank you so much.
So your question is, was New York City or New York State obeying Trump's command, or do you think it was from the mayor? Is that your question?
That was one. Yeah, that was the first question. And the second one was just about whether the educators here believe everyone should have been encouraged to learn remotely, except for specific groups, like special, like students with IEDs and et cetera.
IEPs, yeah.
IEPs, sorry.
Yeah. That's a good question. Do you guys, do our educators think that everyone should have been encouraged to learn remotely, except for certain groups? I'd love to hear what Ms. Willis has to say and what Caleres has to say.
I think Jonathan was about to
Oh, I'm
speak
sorry,
first.
Jonathan. All right, so I'd love to hear what Jonathan has to say.
Me first, or?
Yeah.
As well, okay. I don't know about encouraging people to make a choice. And let me get to your other question. I'm absolutely convinced that before the Trump administration actually did anything, when he was just blowing hard and making noise, that a really bad alliance between Cuomo, de Blasio, the union president Mulgrew, the New York Times, and other institutions came into force that said, we are going to open schools in New York City. I think the decision goes back to May or June. And despite any other evidence, despite anything else, they've been set on it. So I think they made that decision. Obviously, Trump's not opposing it, but Trump's not coming into New York City. And there's plenty of cities that didn't open and didn't really try to open. I'm gonna, and I know it's a little bit out of order, and then I'll get out of the way, but I think it's worth throwing in now. One of the big changes I would want to see in our system is that the stakeholders need to be listened to. I agree with Caleres, should have listened to the parents, but the educators, nobody asked us. And when Mulgrew spoke for us, he spoke for us without asking us. Nobody polled the members, nobody asked the members. And when they made the mistake of doing that, they cut us off. They didn't want to hear it. We knew that there was a problem here. And I don't mean to exclude the parents. I think parents and students and everybody should be involved. But I think that rethinking education ground up from the people who are actually involved in it, like engaged in teaching and engaged in learning, is kind of central to rethinking this stuff. I'm going to pass on the other questions for now, but I wanted to throw that into the mix because I think we need to break through this and find a different way of thinking about how we make decisions about education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Jonathan that this administration was dead set at all levels. Our chancellor said many times that we were going to be the only school system of this size in the country that was going to open point blank. Like I said, we created Parents for Responsive, Equitable, and Safe Schools because we believed that there should have been a delayed, phased-in reopening that prioritized our most vulnerable students. And that includes our English language learners, that includes our students with IEPs, that includes our students in temporary housing. We believe that we should have kept the rec center model for a while for essential workers. We also, in terms of what sorts of things can reduce some of the inequities, we believe that there should be free universal broadband in the city. We also believe that there needs to be some sort of accommodation for childcare. The mayor promised 100,000 seats in learning bridges and then opened 30,000. And so there's lots of parents, lots of teachers that are parents that don't have childcare, don't have access of taking care of their children. And like Gloria mentioned, in terms of the inequities, we have an important conversation right now about screen schools and how screens are really keeping our children out of the schools that are considered good and are maintaining the status quo and sustaining these segregated schools. So we need to talk about admissions, we need to talk about discipline policies, we need to talk about culturally responsive and sustainable pedagogy, we need to talk about trauma-informed practices, healing-centered schools, community schools that provide wraparound services. There's the list 3 is like nothing. Like the list can go on and on about what we need to do in our communities in order to close this access gap, including smaller class sizes, like Leonie said. And what this plan has done is exacerbated all of that in every possible way. And the fact that we need 12,000 additional teachers to get this done correctly, the fact that there are ICT classrooms and children with IEPs that don't have access to special ed teachers is a disgrace. I believe this plan is negligent and it's sloppy, to say the least.
Natasha, did you want me to go next? Yes. Okay. So one inequity I think we need to change immediately is the screening process for gifted and talented. So I had one student that was a great artist and got accepted into LaGuardia. And the only reason she got accepted into LaGuardia is because I got in touch with her mom I met her in the 5th grade and had her mom and had students who went to specialized high school speak to her mom about not just because you're going to a specialized high school, but the atmosphere, the importance, the relationships that you form, the colleagues that you meet. And so I think that's what's missing in like Brownsville. We have so many kids in Brownsville that are level 4s when they're in the 4th grade. I think the mayor needs to, instead of getting rid of the tests, I think he needs to start a task force in reaching out to parents. I think we're not tapping into parents, and let the parents understand the importance of getting ready for specialized high school tests, and have students of color come and speak at our schools about what it is to go to a specialized high school, the good and the bad, and get parents involved. And we don't have parents involved in that process at all. We just send letters home saying that your child can go to a regional site, to get help when they're in the 6th grade. But I think we're missing the parent piece. And I think until we start getting parents involved in that part of what is gifted and talented, and starting from 4th grade, we need to definitely change that aspect. My son, who has an IEP, goes to school every day, and it's made a huge difference in terms of the services that he receives, the classroom that he's in. He has 2 teachers in his class, and I'm glad he's back in school. So it's made a huge difference for him.
I think the push that I have on that is like there's the opportunity for specialized high schools, but then there's also like school. I was a turnaround principal. And so like it's very difficult to get students into a school that is a turnaround school without the stereotype. And so the thing is like we're pushing kids towards specialized high school, but why are we not thinking and focusing in on the schools that they consider to be underperforming? And so those narratives continue to stay at those schools, and which makes it very difficult for them to shift. And so why aren't we bringing kids to have conversations? Or I've always had a problem with the school selection model of kids being able to put down their 8 choices and a magical algorithm puts them into different schools. And what I noticed with that algorithm, I was getting kids from the same zip code, right? And so like I didn't believe in what the algorithm did. And so like we never had the opportunity to get those level 4 students in which that they go to the cream of the crop schools. And so my thing with that is like, how do we continuously build schools that we consider to be underperforming, provide them with the resources that are necessary? Because there are still students that are in those seats that need to be educated at the same level that those kids in the specialized high schools are being educated as well. And so that's my only push to that.
I have to agree. As a neuroscientist, I have to push back on anything about a standardized test. Standardized tests come from eugenics. They come from studies that basically show that only white affluent children can have high IQs. They are meant to keep Black, Latinx, children with IEPs, English language learners out of these schools. And so in order for us to have integrated schools, we need to do away with these gatekeeping tests. There's not going to be any other way. And we need to fund our schools, all of our schools, every single one of them. Even if they're considered bad, struggling schools, they need the money that they deserve in order to move the students up. And that's the only way that we're going to do this. If we continue to categorize our students and our schools, we're not going to get anywhere, and our communities are not going to be able to be elevated.
I want to speak to a point that Mr. Bryant made, Kevin made, and also a point that Tracy made. I worked with Mr. Bryant on student recruitment. I was the parent coordinator at Francis Perkins Academy. And I learned from that process that the DOE is only sending a certain amount of students who apply to your school, as well as from specific zip codes. There are, I don't know what the reasons are for that, but there are reasons for that. And I think our school had a reputation that was, I think, in a lot of ways unfair, but also because of what the DOE was doing, the students were missing out on a very, very important learning environment. The majority of our teachers were Black and brown, and our principal was a Black male. And the studies have shown that students, Black and brown students, learn better from Black and brown teachers. And most of the teachers in New York City's public schools are not Black or brown. Miss Tracy. Tracy was the first Black teacher I met. And she stuck with me for 24 years. When it was time to pick out high schools, although I was a foster kid, and although I had changed foster homes and I was no longer in junior high school or elementary school, since we were still in contact, this Black teacher took me to high school fairs. She was the one that told me about high schools because we had built that relationship and that connection. And that's unfortunately not typical enough. What does it mean to have more representation or more diversity in school leadership, and teachers and educators, and also in student body? Because there are a lot of ways that New York City's public school system is segregated by students, population, by zip code, but also on who educates and who leads. Can we speak to that? That was a mouthful. Jonathan or Tracy or Kevin, or Caleris, of course, or Leonie, would you like to speak to that?
I can put in a plug for the Black Lives Matter at Schools committee. We've been organizing for about 4 years now. And one of our mandates and one of our demands is to increase not just ethnic studies in schools, but also to hire more Black teachers, plain and simple. Like, you're absolutely right. And we see that having access to a Black teacher benefits all students, even white students. And we not just see this in a 3K through high school level, we see this in higher education. And so again, more representation is what supports that access, that mentorship, that support, that sponsorship that a lot of students need throughout their trajectory. So if you want to push the city on that, feel free to join our meetings, Black Lives Matter at Schools.
I didn't want to get too diverted by the issue of the specialized high school which I think in some ways is overemphasized in the entire realm of all the issues that our schools are subjected to and suffering. But I did want to make the point that one thing that very few people ever acknowledge or even understand is how girls are discriminated against specifically in the enrollment of the specialized high schools, as well as Black and Latinx students. So girls do better in terms of their grades in science and math and English. They do better on the state tests in all those subjects, and they get admitted at far lower rates to the specialized high schools because those exams have never been independently assessed for either gender bias or racial bias. Moreover, there are many studies that published peer-reviewed studies that show that grades are a far better predictor for success at the specialized high schools than this very weird exam that we continue to use, the SHSAT. And so if you continue to use academic screens but relied more on grades than on these test scores, you would not only get a much more diverse integrated student body at the specialized high schools, but ones that had many, many more girls. And if we're interested in, encouraging girls to go into STEM careers, I think that that's a direction that we should take.
I've been quiet trying to think of exactly what to say, but I should. When Gloria introduced me, I've been teaching for 18 years at a specialized high school. We've seen over those years, it's especially these last 2 decades, real segregation and growing segregation. In my school, we've made efforts to fight against it, but it's ingrained in the testing culture. The segregation is racial segregation. There's a little bit in my school, a lot in the other schools, of the gender segregation. Leonie's right. My school is less, but it has something to do with specifically with my school, but it's a real factor. And the academic segregation is weird. It means that we're missing richness in our student population. There's not look, Bronx Science isn't where people study science, and Stuyvesant's not a science-only high school, even though they have some advanced classes. Kids go to those schools to be with kids of the same race, or without kids from certain races, or to be with kids taking the same classes, and they miss something. Segregating kids based on race, gender, or ability is a problem. If I had it to do over, I wouldn't come back to the school. I don't think that schools like mine should exist. And look, I love teaching. There's a lot of things I can do in my place that I might not be able to do in others, but it's a privilege, and I understand that it's a privilege. And by setting up schools with privilege, we set up schools without privilege, and that's not okay for anyone. And I'm a teacher in one of those places. I need to be really clear about that.
Thank you. All right, so this discussion is really important, and I want to continue. I see that Lisa has had her hand up for a while, and she's been wanting to speak. So Lisa, do you have a question or something you'd like to add to this discussion?
Yeah, actually, hello. It's interesting that this is where I'm coming in because it's tangential to why I originally raised my hand, but it's specific to my specialty, actually. I'm trained as a middle school math teacher, and I worked in the schools for a while, and now I own a tutoring business that is basically student-centered, and I personally and most of my staff are anti-test. We campaign against standardized testing. That said, a lot of students come to us to take the SAT to get into college, and a lot of students come to us to take the SHSAT, and I make at least a third of my income off of preparation for the SHSAT. Now, so I've been working with the SHSAT for years as an anti-test person. So it's kind of entertaining. My experience with the SHSAT, because I know the students from when they were younger, is that it's not a biased test. It's not biased racially. language-wise, yes, you have to have a strong command of the English language. So an English language learner is going to be at a disadvantage on the verbal side, and for a good part of the math side, because there are lots of language nuances. And it's not biased against girls either. What I find is that it's a measure of the inequities that the kids get from grades K through 7. And I've helped a lot of students of color practice for the test, and they're just as good as the white kids. Even if they don't come from money, if they're willing to do the work. And yes, it's a strange test, and it's a strange test on purpose. You have to study for it. That's what the schools are testing for. Are you willing to work once you come here? Well, then prove it to us by practicing and studying for this test that you've never seen anything like. So
I think you made a good point. Like the test is trying to prep how dedicated you are to your academics.
Yeah,
and there are people that can, and students and families that can afford test prep where others cannot.
Right.
And that's a worthy, that's like both of what you said, like they're both very, very worthy things to consider. I think what you're saying is important, but I also think other people have been raising their hands and they want to
yes, okay. So I just wanted to say that part and say that my experience is that it measures the inequities of our elementary schools. And because of that, I want us to do the elementary schools. But the original reason why I raised my hand was, the question was, what can we do to make more equity in the classrooms? And from my personal experience, I think not just class size, but having 2 teachers in the room, the ICT model. The ICT.
Cara. Yeah, sorry about that. Someone isn't muted. Go ahead, I'm sorry, please continue.
Okay, sorry. So the ICT model actually decreases a lot of the natural academic insecurities, the natural microaggressions. If the ICT classes, a lot of that stuff doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is really important, but like I do want to get to Tara. So hopefully we can come back. What you're saying is important.
Yes. Tara? So I would like to just add also that we know how the inequity is so strong right now. And I think we're all afraid that when this situation, when we all get vaccinated and we go back into the schools, the kids that were behind are going to be more behind. And if we're not going to enter into the new school, the schools in a more positive way with changes, we're going to just keep falling behind. So I don't know how, and I don't know how we're going to make these changes. I just want to read a quick tweet that Mark Traeger just said. What should close immediately is the May is failing and the inequitable hybrid school model. And I think that sums it up fairly well. So what are we going to do? I mean, how are we going to do things that are different? And I don't, there is inequity. I was in a school that was rezoned in Dumbo so that it was rezoned so that if the parents were going to send their kids to their new zone school, that school would have been an integrated school, but the parents wouldn't send them. So the problem is deep. We've seen this problem of deep in our country. We saw it with this election. It is a huge problem. And those that didn't realize it or that were deluding themselves a little, like me, the blinders are off. So moving forward, it has to be fixed.
Tara, would you like to add something to this discussion? That's okay. Thomas also had his hand raised for a while. Thomas, would you like to add something to this discussion?
So I had my hand raised for a number of moments, but I feel like they've all passed. But I am a firm supporter of what Colares was saying about the regional enrichment sites was what should have been the model for the reopening of New York City schools. We should have also, what Jonathan said, we should have had educators leading the way as far as their voices and their input, making the decisions, not the mayor. If we had prioritized those who with transitional housing, those with learning difficulties, be them IEPs or otherwise, those with difficulties standing between them and remote learning, which is entirely inefficient and not a permanent solution by any means, but is the solution during a pandemic. If we had prioritized them and only them in our buildings, we could have done this well, and we could have done, we would have closed a lot of gaps in the inequities that we are now exacerbating.
Thank you. Yeah, that's true. Like, it's kind of piled on, right? There's this issue that we haven't addressed, and then this came on and we still didn't address it, and now we have like everything. It's like a ball rolling down a hill. I'm sure a teacher would be able to say that better. Linda, you have been raising your hand for a while too. Would you like to add something to this discussion?
Can I ask my question?
Sure.
Well, it's actually a couple. One from a while ago where Gloria had mentioned the stats that are coming in from the testing that is showing that the infection rate is very, very low in the schools, even as it is going up in the city as a whole. Infection rates in the school are showing to be less than 0.25%. But you see more things opening in the city. You see more businesses opening in the city. And I wonder if, what your thoughts are, what the panelists' thoughts are on prioritizing businesses, bars and restaurants, and as needed as those businesses are and those jobs are. It's known that those places are increasing infection rates. Offices are reopening. Not as many people are working remotely as they had been. They're going back into offices, and those things are driving infection rates. Whereas the schools are not, and whether or not some of these businesses are being preferenced to the learning needs of our children. Although we've kind of moved away from that question. So I did have another one too, which is about funding. The city obviously is strapped for funds. They're not getting the tax revenue that they used to get because businesses are closed. There's lots of needs in the city. Where do the panelists think that this money can come from? I mean, the federal government has to step up, but that's got to be a part of the question here in dealing with improving the schools. A lot of it does get down to resources and money. And how come the richest city in the country doesn't have the money for its schools?
That's a good question. So where does the money to fund our schools come from? Or what can we do about the funding shortfall? Kevin, Tracy, John, Leonie, Caleres, anybody want to chime in?
There are about 10 bills in the state legislature that would raise billions of dollars. They range from increased taxes on the super wealthy, increased taxes on pied-à-terre apartments, which are second homes that are worth more than $5 million, putting back the stock transfer tax, which existed since between 1905 and the 1970s, that would raise literally billions of dollars. Putting back a tax on private planes and yachts, which were apparently eliminated sometime under Cuomo. There are so many revenue proposals out there. I can't even begin to tell you all of them, but basically they would all focus on raising revenue for the super wealthy in New York City, where we have the highest income inequality in the entire country. and where billionaires have continued to make billions of dollars during this pandemic, where most everybody else is losing out. So they're practical and real proposals on the table. We've been waiting for our state legislature to pass them. Apparently Cuomo has been very resistant to approving them until he was sure that we weren't going to get more money from the federal government, because one of Cuomo's biggest principles is not to raise taxes, period. And he has been averse to doing that and averse to funding our schools sufficiently and equitably over his entire term in office. So I think those are the things that we should be pushing.
Thank you. We have one more question.
Wait, can I address the testing situation?
Yes, really quickly, please.
Yeah, really quickly. So NYU released a study when the DOE proposed this random testing that basically showed that the proposal that they have for testing was not going to be effective. Unfortunately, the only people that are being tested right now are students and teachers that have provided consent. So we don't have enough of a sample to make any sort of prediction in terms of how schools are affecting any sort of transmission. 1, 2, only 26% of children are actually attending in person. So you have a whole 75% of students that are not even in schools, and communities are the ones responsible for keeping those infection rates down. It's not this testing model, and it's not the city.
Can I just add on to one Leonie's point? So Ed Trust came out with a report last week or 2 weeks ago, and the pieces around this, the state legislature is some of the elements, and then they added 2 other ones. One was around just protecting education budgets regardless of the deficits, and then 2 was shield high poverty and low wealth districts while mandating an equity plan for funding. And so like those are 2 additional pieces that they added in to try to make sure that these communities are protected throughout this pandemic. I think the other thing that comes to light as Clara spoke as well was like we haven't gotten remote learning right. And so that's been like the biggest piece. And I think that we had an opportunity over from April to now to get remote learning right. And because we haven't gotten remote learning right, and in-person teaching was also not the best during however long you want to look back on, like we're in this kind of crux. And so like that's the piece where we're trying to figure out, and it's very difficult for, I think, government and city officials to make a decision on which way to go, because they never took the time out to really hone in on one element or the other.
Thank you, Mr. Bryant. When we were doing our run through, Mr. Bryant asked such a good question that I have made it part of our framing questions. It's because he's a teacher, he's an educator. It was, and this is to all our panelists, if you were a king or queen and had a magic wand, what would you do or make happen to fix the inequities or to address the inequities? What is the right way? And I want to ask Miss Tracy, Miss Willesee first, because I haven't heard from you and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I think one of the first things I would do is provide a safe space for students in the building. To me, that's like extremely important. Sensory gym, whatever you want to call it, just a safe space where they can go and just be themselves and bring back art and music. All those different things need to come back into the building. Those are 2, and really start a committee that really empowers parents with students that have IEPs and explain to them what their rights are in advocacy, and that they don't have to accept what's written in the IEP, and just, you know, what their rights are and what they can do to help their kids. So those are like the 3 things.
Thank you. Kyleris or Kevin or Leonie or Jonathan, would you guys like to chime in with your magic powers?
Show me the money.
Uh,
I mean, until we don't have the money to fund our schools, we're kind of still dealing with a lot of inequities. So I hope that Governor Cuomo ponies up and passes these bills so that we can start decreasing our class sizes. We can start supporting schools at all levels and provide our students with everything that they need.
So I want to just give another quick idea about where we can get the money, because I agree, that is crucial. All of the ideas that Leonie gave are excellent and we need to work on that. But another place is, I'm not sure if everyone realizes it, but about 50% of our tax dollars are not going to our schools. It's going to to fund the Pentagon and to fund wars and the destruction of schools and killing children around the world. I don't have to go through the specifics. So there is a campaign right now, and I'll be brief. It's called Move the Money New York City, and we have a resolution in the city council. Now you're going to say, the city council? Well, yeah, let's start in New York City and tell the city council to pass this bill which says, cut the Pentagon budget and use that money to fund our community needs, especially schools, well, including schools. So right now we have 1/3 of the city council has supported that bill. That's 18 city council people. We need about 8 more to support it. And then it will become, put New York City online saying this, and other cities and states will follow. It will start at the bottom and it will move up. So we can make this a reality. And I would like to invite everyone to our next meeting. I'm going to put the information in the chat. And for more information, you can go to our website, go to Facebook and ask more questions. Again, I'll put all this information in the chat.
Thank you, Gloria. Molly wants to say something, and then Hunter.
What I wanted,
Go ahead, you're not muted. Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to come back to the funding question, and Tara raised it in a general sense, and Gloria came in with move the money. But I want to really emphasize how important it is to tackle this outrageous, obscene funding of the Pentagon. It's nearly 60% of discretionary spending. Unless we can cut the money going to the military, there is no way we can substantially improve education in New York City or any place else. Nowhere we can have a Green New Deal. Nowhere we can have many of the progressive things we want. So as we deal with each of these really important issues, we have to constantly ask, how is the federal government prioritizing its funding, and how can we change it? Because we have to claw that money back to get what we want.
Yeah, and didn't Trump increase the Pentagon budget by like an obscene amount?
Mm-hmm. And we'll probably try to do it more between now and when he is finally pushed out the door on January 20th. So it's an ongoing battle because the Democrats are not always so much better at it. So we have a lot of work ahead.
Thank you. Timothy, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Timothy disappeared. Oh, there he is.
Yeah, I'm still here. First off, I want to say this was like a really, really great and informative panel. As a lifetime, I basically spent my whole entire life in public education, from like kindergarten all the way through high school. I went to a CTE school, not quite a specialized high school, but CTE is also really, really good. I went to CUNY and just recently graduated from CUNY. So I think that it's super important that people that talk about college and the collegiate experience, especially overall, it's always, hey, go away, get out of town, get an experience somewhere else. What do you think is going to be one of the biggest problems for high school students, as they're graduating from New York City public schools, and their decision, and whether or not CUNY is going to be substantially funded well enough to take on the huge increase of students that are probably going to be enrolling in CUNY locally. So I wanted to ask if anybody wanted to kind of talk about the importance of higher ed.
I think Jonathan and Kevin are particularly adept at answering that question right now because they both have background in teaching high school students. But of course, any of our panelists, please.
I would say that Clarice is probably, if she's already working in CUNY, would probably be the one who could speak to that the most, as she's seeing students regularly. So I'll jump and throw it to her, and then I'll piggyback off of what she poses out there.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm a professor at CUNY. I've been in CUNY for over 10 years. We are seeing significant budget cuts also at CUNY, so we are in a deficit. It's been really interesting. We've actually been seeing an increase in enrollment in most CUNY campuses, except for City College. City College has actually seen a decrease in enrollment. One of the things that we are definitely talking about, and now the SAT and the ACT are optional when you apply for CUNY. So we're eliminating standardized tests in all of our admissions, which will hopefully continue to bring in students. And as a union, we're also fighting for funding for CUNY. So we are hoping that the same bills that are being pushed to fund public schools will also be supported so that we can get that funding in CUNY. So we are getting ready to see an increase in enrollment, and we're relying on all of these different bills to tax the rich, the Peter tax, to support our students. And we're looking forward to a more diverse student body by eliminating the standardized tests.
That's wonderful. Thank you. It's a lot of work. Yeah.
Say something about if I had, could wave a magic wand. It would not only be obviously about class size, but also to implement some of the measures that we've seen at private colleges across the country, including at NYU, where my husband teaches part-time. They are testing all the staff and all the students twice a week and not letting anyone on campus or in a building that hasn't tested negative. Now, obviously, this would take a tremendous amount of money for the million students in New York City public schools and the hundreds of thousands of teachers and staff. And we don't have it. But if I could design the world the way I wanted to, that's what we would be doing here in New York City for our students and our staff to make sure that they stay safe. I happen to believe that the random testing does show a pretty safe level of safety in terms of the health precautions that are being used in our schools. I wanted to point out that in Europe, they are putting a priority on keeping schools open as opposed to bars and restaurants. I think that we should be doing that here as well. I think schools are one of the most essential aspects of our society, and if we should be doing everything we can to keep them open, but keep them safe for everyone inside at the same time.
Great point, Leonie. Thank you. Do any of our other panelists want to add anything to what Leonie said?
I want to thank her for bringing us back to the magic wands question. If we're really allowed a magic wand. I'd like to think about what we actually teach and what we actually do in school. And that maybe in this horrible moment, this is a place where we can shake some of that up. I like that the regents were canceled for January, but it's more than just testing, although I'd like to get rid of all of those test regimes. And that comes back to, I think Tracy was talking about empowering communities and empowering parents. And I don't think just for IEPs, I think for everything. There are questions about what's important to learn that we just assume because that's what we learned ourselves, or that's what the Board of Regents or the federal government or somebody told us, or the test makers told us that we're supposed to learn. There's plenty of stuff on those specialized tests that we learn because they're on the tests. But in order to do that, we need to involve, and I think I said before, involve stakeholders, which means teachers and parents and kids, some of that decision making about what's actually important to learn. I have a quick story. I'm not going to go on for long, but I got involved. I'll put it into the chat with a group called the New York City Liberation School. They're like running a school for an online school for kids. It seemed neat, and the name was good, and the people involved were cool. And I was proposing to them. I said, well, maybe I could do this math thing with kids where instead of doing like curricular math, we could do like games and puzzles. And they came back at me. They said, why don't you work with parents? Why don't you work with parents so that parents have a role in the education of their kids, to re-involve, to reintegrate everybody in that process? We assume that education doesn't happen in Black and brown homes. I don't need to label that assumption. Everybody here knows what that is. We just don't think about that. I think we need to rethink magic wand, to rethink education in a real serious way. And as we're doing it, that would provide, I think that's a magic wand thing that's not about to happen, but that would provide places to really address some of the built-in inequities that we don't even begin to challenge on a daily basis. I'm sorry, that's far away. Plus all the funding and all the small class size and everything that everybody else has said, but this too.
all right, so yes, I wish we had more time to really get into these questions and these discussions, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's almost 8 o'clock, and I would love to hear all of our panelists' closing statements. Like 30 seconds of what you want to make sure that the people who are here tonight leave with, thoughts or ideas or questions. Like, I would love to hear like a closing statement, if you have one.
Well, I think I've said enough about my opinions tonight. I wanted to say that I'd really love to hear from principals and teachers and parents who are on this call about what some of the good things that happened this year. I think Tracy mentioned that having a class of 10 was great. I would like to hear more of that, things that have worked well and things that have not worked well. And I really want to hear more from the field because I feel very isolated here in my home and my office. So if you have comments, I'd love to hear them. My email is my first and last name @gmail.com. I'm also looking for guests for my radio show who are willing to talk about their experiences this year. If you're willing to come, on and talk about this publicly or just the two of us, but I really want to hear some of the good things that have happened and some of the things that aren't so good, but especially the good things.
Thank you, Leonie.
I think I'll just end with just saying, like, be persistent. Like, we're gonna have to be persistent throughout this pandemic. Things are rapidly changing every single day, and it can wear down on a lot of us depending on what's happening personally, what we see on the news, like what's happening in our household. Second thing I would think about is collaborate. Like, there are so many ideas and so many brilliant folks that are out there within your social network and outside of your social network. And so, like, like, people are in front of their screens now. Connect with people that you may not have ever thought of connecting with previously. Like, I've reached out to folks and like they accept the responses and we've had great conversations. The last thing is just connect with loved ones and connect with friends. Like I said, this is a really isolating time right now, and a lot of individuals are by themselves or stuck within their families, and so just really find time to connect with loved ones and friends.
Thank you, Mr. Bryant.
So press would love to have more folks involved in the conversation. We hold bi-weekly meetings on Zoom and host parents and answer questions. Our steering committee is composed of a lot of parent leaders that have access to the Department of Education. So we get that information and we try to keep our communities informed. So we have a Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, so feel free to follow us. And come join our community conversations and our office hours so we can continue to advocate for safe schools for our students, but also schools that center equity and keep in mind our most vulnerable students.
Thank you, Caloris. Thank you so far, everyone, for being here. Jonathan, Tracy, is there something you'd like to add?
I've said it all. Just thank you for everybody for coming and staying this long to listen to this conversation. I know it was rambling. The stuff is important. Equality is important. Equity is important. Education is really important. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So important. And I want to applaud also the trying to make connections. It's so hard sometimes because there are so many different groups and organizations, all good ones, but everyone likes to be alone and separate, and they all want to talk the loudest. So I think we have to step back and talk softer with each other and make connections. And maybe we have a chance.
Yeah. There are so many people that raised their hands, posted amazing comments in the chat that like wanted to add to the conversation. And unfortunately, because of time constraints, we couldn't get to all of them, but we want to. So can you please, like, I'm saving this chat just for the future and, you know, something to look back on. And can you guys, if you have anything else that you want to add or that we haven't addressed, please send us an email, or me personally an email with it. In a few days, we'll be sending you guys an email about this event and reconnecting and, you know, just recapping what happened tonight, what we discussed tonight. And I want to keep the conversation going because the school year is still going amongst everything. Parents are still trying to figure it out. Teachers are still teaching. Students are still finding excuses. They're still there. And this is a very important, informative time, you know, like we're a part of US history. We're a part of like a conversation. We're a part of each other's lives in a way that we've never been before. I want to thank all of our panelists, Mr. Kevin Bryant, Miss Kalira Salas Ramirez, I think I said that right this time, Miss Leonie Hamison, Mr. Jonathan Howabee, Mrs. Tracy Wilsey, and so thank you so much to Gloria Brandman for agreeing to co-moderate with me. You're amazing. Thank you, Noam and Sam, for facilitating in the background. Thank you, Charlotte, for being our fearless leader in all of this. Thank you, everyone on the PEJ subcommittee, Molly, Bruce, Tara. Thank you guys, all of you. Without this team, the work couldn't get done. And without our members, we would have no one who's listening to us and our own crazy ideas. So if you want to be a member, please go to our website, brooklynpeace.org, and sign up. Look us up on Facebook, just search Brooklyn for Peace, or Twitter, Brooklyn, the number 4 and Peace. Same thing for Instagram. And yeah, good night. This video was recorded, so you can see it on our YouTube probably by tomorrow. You can see it on our Facebook right now. And be well.
Stay well.
Yeah.
Stay safe. Wear a mask.
Yes, wear a mask. And congratulations on getting this far in 2020. It was just, you made it this far. Just like a few more weeks and we did it. We made it through 2020. Good night. Be well.